Good morning, 7 East. I am your host, Mr. LEPRE. It's Wednesday, my dudes, for this Wednesday edition of Free LEPRE Radio. We have a short show today because I want to get right down to business. So, on this Wednesday, you have a new assignment to do, which is due Friday. But this assignment, I would apologize, but I'm not sincerely sorry. This assignment might actually take you a while to do. And because there's a lot of writing for it, I want to do it with you to make your life easier. So, on our agenda, let's take a look. Short one for today. Only 2 objectives. We're going to do the compromises that made the Constitution assignment. And then we're going to end the video with some funny videos that I happen to find that might raise your spirits during this time of quarantine, self-isolation, cabin fever, and all of that horrible stuff. So, let's get right down to business. I'm going to X out of my presentation. And I'm going to open up the one-page readings. So you all have this in Google Classroom. There are 6 compromises. 1 page each. And now let's look at the assignment itself. So it's a chart. 3 columns. 6 rows. 1 for each compromise. And what I'm going to do with you right now is I'm going to read through each compromise and give you the basics. We'll do at least the first page together, then I'll leave the second page for you. What one side wants on the left side, what the other side wants on the right side, and then the compromise, where do they meet in the middle. If you watched the video from yesterday, you'll remember I used that episode of The Office, Conflict Resolution, to show you what it means to make a compromise. Both sides give something up and meet in the middle. So let's start with our first compromise, and that is the Great Compromise, because it was great. So I'm going to read this, and you can read along, or you can listen, whichever works best for you, and you can be looking at your notes and start filling them in as soon as you identify anything that should belong in the chart. So, starting from the top, the Great Compromise. There's a reason why the Great Compromise is called the Great Compromise, because it was great. The Constitution was not going to pass unless this compromise was made. The most important issue to the delegates was how much power their state would have in the new national or federal government. The legislature in particular. States with big populations like Virginia didn't think it was fair if states with small populations like Rhode Island had basically the same amount of power in the national government. If they did, you could have a situation where a state with 40,000 people has the exact same amount of power as a state with 40 million people. On the other hand, small states saw no point in joining a unified country where they would have basically no power in the national government compared to the big states. The Articles of Confederation definitely favored the small states on this question. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state, regardless of how many people lived in them, had the exact same amount of power. The big states were never going to agree to a constitution that kept that system in place, and the Great Compromise proved to be one of the most creative aspects of the Constitution to solve this issue. It was decided in the Great Compromise that the legislature would be divided into 2 houses or chambers, the Senate and House of Representatives. In the Senate, each state would have equal representation, 2 senators per state, and be responsible mainly for issues that affected the entire country, issues of war and peace, treaties, judges, etc. In the House of Representatives, each state's number of representatives would depend on the size of their population. Because the House is supposed to be more reflective of the sizes of the states, it specializes in issues related to money, so that each state feels like their representatives can be watchdogs for their level of contribution and tax money to the government. Regardless of what each house specializes in, both houses need to vote for any bill before it becomes a law. This ensures a fair balance between the interests of big states and small states. That is our first compromise, and let me go to my note chart and show you an example of how you're actually going to fill this out. So it should have been clear from my reading of it that the big divide here is between big states and small states. So big states want representation based on population, and small states, on the other hand, want representation to be equal between states. It's that simple. You're just writing what each side wants. Then the compromise, what was in the middle. And the compromise, as we know from listening to me read it or reading it yourself, is the legislative branch will have two parts or houses Senate and House of Representatives, with one based on population and the other with equal membership. So it's trying to make both sides happy. The big states want all of it based on population. The small states want all of it based on equal representation. They don't get all of what they want. They give something up, and they basically come to an agreement that they're going to have a legislative branch with two parts to it. One part favors the big states, one part favors the small states. It's trying to get them to come together, and it does. And this is the Great Compromise. Let's look at the next two on the front page, and then you can do the back on your own for the assignment. So our next compromise is the Three-Fifths Compromise, a very controversial one, and we'll see why. So I'm going to read from the top. The Three-Fifths Compromise is probably the most controversial and most discussed aspect of the U.S. Constitution. It blended together issues related to both slavery and congressional representation, making its solution one of the most bizarre points of the Constitution. After the Great Compromise, when it was decided that the number of seats each state had in the House of Representatives would depend on the size of their population, the question still remained as to whether slaves should be counted or not for purposes of representation and taxation. Northerners and anti-slavery delegates did not believe that Southern or big slave-owning states should get more representatives from their slaves. Legally speaking, slaves were property, not citizens, so why should they be counted for representation? Why should the Southern states gain more political representation for owning slaves? These were the arguments of those saying slaves should not be counted for representation. Southerners and pro-slavery delegates disagreed. They argued that while slaves were not citizens, they were still people and should be counted in the total population for representation and taxation. The resulting compromise between the two sides was kind of crazy. Instead of simply counting the slaves or not counting the slaves, the delegates agreed to only count 3 out of every 5 slaves for representation. This basically meant that a slave only counted as 3/5 of a person, as if being a slave wasn't already degrading enough. The weirdness of this compromise shows just how creative the delegates had to be to get the Constitution in a position to be ratified by all 13 states. So just like we did for our first compromise, I'm going to go back to the chart. On one side, we have the Northern anti-slavery delegates don't want slaves counted at all for representation and taxation. And then on the other hand, the other side, you have the Southern / pro-slavery delegates want all slaves counted for representation and taxation. And the compromise is in the title itself. The compromise was only 3 out of 5 slaves will be counted for representation and taxation. There we go. So we have the two sides here. Not every side is the same. So we have big states versus small states. Here we have northern states or anti-slavery states versus southern or pro-slavery states. And we have our two compromises. I'll do one more, and then the back side can be left for you to do on your own. So our last one, let me just lower the font so we can fit this all on one page. Perfect. Our third compromise, the slave trade compromise. Reading from the top. The issue that would be the main dividing point in the United States for its first 100 years of existence was the issue of slavery. Topics related to slavery came up again and again in the drafting of the Constitution, and would keep coming up in early laws of the United States. Already at the time of the Constitutional Convention, there was large and growing support to make slavery completely illegal. It was believed by many that the new nation, which was supposed to be the example of freedom to the world, should have no part in keeping people as slaves. The problem was that the economy of half the country absolutely needed slavery to survive, and they would refuse to remain part of the new nation unless slavery remained legal. One area where there was room for compromise was the issue of the slave trade. Those, especially in the North, who wanted slavery made illegal or abolished, later called abolitionists, wanted the slave trade to end immediately. They believed it was cruel, and the country should be working to end it, not continue it. For the Southern slave owners, they already had a lot of slaves in America, but they still wanted the option to import new slaves from across the Atlantic if they needed more. The proposed ban on the slave trade would only apply to the transatlantic slave trade, not to trade within the country. Neither side felt this issue was of the highest importance, so there was room for compromise. Although the issue was serious, neither Northern or Southern delegates who supported the Constitution wanted to be tripped up by this controversy. The resulting slave trade compromise was kind of like a band-aid. The delegates agreed that resolving the question of banning the slave trade would be postponed until 20 years following the ratification of the Constitution. The convention basically kicked the can down the road, saying the slave trade would remain legal at least for the next 20 years. In 1808, exactly 20 years after ratification, a ban on the slave trade was signed into law by then-President Thomas Jefferson. Just like we did for the last two. What one side wants. Northern anti-slavery delegates want the slave trade to end immediately. And then on the other side, we have our Southern pro-slavery delegates want the slave trade to remain legal permanently. Just reduce the font again. And then the compromise, as we just read, the compromise was the slave trade compromise said the slave trade would remain legal for 20 years after ratification of the Constitution, and then it could be outlawed, which it was. So this is our first set of compromises, our first three. I've gone through them with you right now. The backside should be no different. So the backside of the sheet, or on the second page, you have 3 more compromises to do. I trust that you can do those on your own after seeing this example. Having done these along with me, you can now do the others on your own. So that is the assignment. It is due Friday. And remember, please make sure you click the Turn It In button. If you're not completing the assignments, we will be emailing and calling home. We have to do this. And for the foreseeable future, as long as we're doing distance learning, get used to it, because that's what we got to do. So that brings me to the end of my assignment portion. And the second thing on my agenda today was just to cap off this episode of Free LEPRE Radio with a few funny videos I found. So brace yourself. Here they come. And have a good day. Enjoy this Wednesday, the middle of the week. If you have any questions about the assignment, fill in the Google check-in form. And always make sure that you are able to email me. I respond very quickly. But as for our videos, here they go.
No one told you life was gonna be this way. Go and do it for me. Now watch me wear.
Surprise! Now we got you a scooter now. We got you a scooter, you must say.
Surprise!
No. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no. No, what's the road? What's the road? No, what's the road?